Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today is the fifth of our 11 critical battles. This time we're going back to ancient Greece to follow up last month's war story on the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. This month, we're looking at the follow-up campaign in that fight, the Second Greco-Persian War of 480 to 479 BCE. Which means you're going to get 3 battles for the price of 1, because everybody knows about the Battle of Thermopylae, the story of the 300 Spartans. But we don't often talk about that battle in the context of the war. Everybody knows about the heroic last stand, but not why they fought there or what happened after the battle that made it important. Because let's be honest, if the Spartans and their allies had gone down heroically at Thermopylae, and the Persians had gone on from there to conquer the Greek city-states, we probably would have forgotten about them by now. So today we're going to tell the war story of not just Thermopylae, but the 2 major battles that followed it, the naval battle of Salamis and the decisive land battle of Plataea. And because we're looking at 3 battles today, this episode is going to go a little longer than usual. In fact, it's going to go so long that we're going to split it into 2 parts. We'll do the build-up and Thermopylae in the first one, then Salamis and Plataea in the second part. I hope you don't mind. But before we jump into the background for the war, I want to show you a book that really helped me get a handle on the Battle of Thermopylae. This is not an official promotion. Nobody's paying me to plug this book, although you will find my affiliate link in the video description. This book is called Gates of Fire by Steven Pressfield. This is a historical novel, not an actual history book, but it is one of the best fucking historical novels I have ever read. If you're familiar with a book called The Killer Angels by Michael Shara, where he tells the story of the Battle of Gettysburg from the points of view of soldiers who fought in it, Gates of Fire is that for Thermopylae. Pressfield was a Marine, so he understands how fighting men interact and bond with each other. And he understands how to drop you into an unfamiliar culture that's been dead for 2,000 years and bring it to life. And how to take a battle where guys fought in ways we don't fight anymore, with weapons we don't use anymore, and make you live it. Gates of Fire by Steven Pressfield. Highly recommended. Check out this book. So that's enough intro, I think. Let's get into the Second Greco-Persian War. Now, if you haven't seen the war story about the Battle of Marathon, you might want to go check it out. You can find it somewhere around here. It's up here somewhere. We don't just talk about the battle, we go into the reasons for it. Why the Persians decided to invade the Greek city-states in the first place, and why the Athenians faced them almost alone. But if you don't want to do that, here's a quick recap. The Persians, or as you'll often hear them called, the Achaemenids, took about 30 years to become the biggest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. Between 559 and 530 BCE, the empire's founder, Cyrus the Great, conquered all of Mesopotamia, all of Anatolia, and Central Asia east to the border of modern-day Pakistan. His successors, Cambyses and Darius, added Egypt and a good chunk of North Africa, expanded east to the Indus River, and pushed the empire into modern-day Europe by taking over the coast of the Balkans from Macedon to Thrace. It was under Darius, who became what the Persians called King of Kings in 522 BCE, that the Achaemenid Empire reached its greatest extent. But it was far from peaceful. Because the thing about conquering a huge empire within a single human lifetime is you leave a lot of bad blood behind you. People who remember what it was like to be in charge of their own destinies. And if you leave those people with any power, they're going to try to get back in charge. So every few years, Darius had to stop what he was doing and smack down a rebellion somewhere. One of the rebellions he had to smack down was in Ionia, a loose confederation of city-states on the west coast of Anatolia, or as the Greeks called it, Asia Minor, that had been settled by Greeks before the Persians took over. In 499 BCE, several of these cities revolted against Achaemenid rule, and it wasn't just the Ionians. In 498 BCE, Athens and Eretria, two city-states from the Greek mainland, sent reinforcements to help the Ionians fight. Because the one thing the Greeks liked more than fighting each other was fighting other people. And who could be a better adversary than the world's biggest empire? Well, of course, the Persians put down the Ionian revolt, but the fight was longer and harder than Darius expected it to be. The Ionians finally returned to the empire in 493 BCE. But Athens and the other city-states that had aided the revolt just put their troops on their ships and sailed them back across the Aegean Sea and out of Darius's reach. And that put Greece on Darius's world map. Because if you're a conqueror and an empire builder, and there's an aggressive people living just on the other side of your border, it just makes sense to try to bring them inside your border. To paraphrase President Lyndon Johnson, it would be better to have the Athenians inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. Of course, Johnson was talking about Richard Nixon, not Athens, but his metaphor is surprisingly fitting. So in 492 BCE, Darius sent a general by the name of Mardonius to bring the Greeks inside the Achaemenid tent. He managed to get Thrace and Macedon under control, but before he could get to Greece proper, his supply fleet ran into a severe storm in the Aegean and had to turn back. With his resupply link broken, Mardonius had to turn his army back. Darius's next move was to send messengers to all the Greek city-states, asking them nicely to become part of his empire. They all agreed, except for Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful states. They sent Darius the most strongly worded go fuck yourself they could think of, killing his messengers. At which point Darius said something like, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy, and launched another invasion, this time across the Aegean Sea in 490 BCE. The two generals who led the invasion, Artaphernes and Datis, attacked several Greek islands before burning Eretria, Athens' partner in crime from the Ionian revolt. Then they turned down the coast and met the Athenian army at Marathon. And the Athenians, surprising pretty much everybody except the Athenians, kicked their asses. Led by a general named Miltiades and outnumbered about 2-1, the Athenian troops managed to convince the Persians to get back on their ships at the cost of maybe a quarter of their army. And they did it without Spartan help, which made Athens look like the cock of the walk. So here we are in 490 BCE. You got this little bitty house cat called Athens strutting back and forth in his little yard because he just kicked the shit out of the tiger across the street. And he's got the rest of the Greek kiddies thinking just maybe they don't have to give in to the tiger after all. Well, Darius just couldn't have that. Not only does that kind of thing have a tendency to spread to other parts of an empire, but now you got to imagine it's personal. Just think about it from Darius' point of view. His grandfather built an empire larger than anything anybody had ever seen. And so far, he and his dad had managed to keep expanding it and keep things running pretty well. And now here's this tiny little city that thinks it can come up against him. And so far, it's been right. If he wants to be taken seriously as a king, if he wants his name to appear in the same kind of stories as his grandfather's, he's going to have to nip this shit in the bud. So he started making plans, putting a new fleet together, building an invasion force, figuring out what kinds of supplies it was going to need and how to deliver. But in 486 BCE, another rebellion rose up in Egypt. And before Darius could get it under control, he inconveniently died. And his son Xerxes took over the Achaemenid Empire. Now Xerxes doesn't seem to have been quite as personally peeved at the Greeks as his dad was. Not yet, at least. But he did keep the dream alive of going back to bring him within the empire. Because even if the Athenians didn't need to be spanked for standing up to the King of Kings, you got to imagine he was having fantasies of how to incorporate their heavy infantry into his army. Because to be honest, Greece didn't have much in the way of resources the Achaemenid Empire needed. But that infantry was one of the few forces that had managed to stand up to the Persian archers in the last almost 80 years. And if he was going to push his empire up into Europe, it'd be a good idea to have some folks who knew how to fight the way the Europeans fought. So how did they fight? What was it that gave the Greeks such an advantage over the Persians on the battlefield? Well, the Persians liked to fight from a distance. Their military doctrine was built around archers, whose job was to kill people and disrupt an enemy's formation. And if that wasn't enough to drive the enemy off the field, they had a few units of heavy infantry with spears and shields who could close with and destroy the enemy, who was already on the verge of breaking from the hail of arrows. The most famous of these heavy units was an elite division, more or less a division, called the Immortals, a unit of 10,000 veterans that was apparently called the Immortals because the Achaemenids were careful to always keep it at full strength. When the Immortals took casualties, they would be replaced with veterans, not green recruits, just as quickly as the Empire could manage it. So even though no soldier was actually immortal, the unit never got any smaller. But even the Immortals were lightweights compared to the Greeks. The basic unit of the Greek armies was the hoplite. This was a heavy infantryman, armed with a spear and a large round shield, big enough to cover himself from neck to knees and provide some protection to the man on his left as well. And behind the shield, he wore a bronze helmet that covered his whole head, as opposed to just the leather or bronze caps the Persian infantry would be wearing. He had a full breastplate made of leather or bronze or layered linen, and bronze greaves protecting his lower legs from knee to ankle. This combination of armor and shield gave him very good protection, especially for the time period, which would have cut down on the fear that comes with hefting a pointy stick and charging other guys with pointy sticks. But the hoplite alone was still just a dude, well armored but with weak points, who would eventually go down if you shot enough arrows at him. What made him powerful was the way he fought, shoulder to shoulder in a tight formation called a phalanx. This phalanx would usually be 8 ranks deep and as wide as it needed to be to negotiate the terrain of the battlefield. Each man's shield would protect him and the man to his left, and the shields overlapped to make it harder for an enemy to sneak his blade in between them. This phalanx acted as what historian John Keegan described as a plow of flesh, just cutting through pretty much any formation that wasn't another phalanx. And the phalanx was the Greek standard formation. They didn't lean on light infantry or cavalry or chariots the way many armies of the day did. And it had worked for them so far against the Persians. In fact, at Marathon, they had learned they could reduce their exposure to Persian arrows by closing the distance at a run. And when the phalanx closed with a line of archers, it didn't go well for the archers. So what were the hoplites up against? Xerxes assembled a huge army from all over his empire. Medes, Israelites, Indians, Ethiopians, Egyptians, Arabs, Assyrians, and plenty of others. He would have had heavy infantry with spears, light infantry archers, horse cavalry, camel cavalry, chariots, maybe some elephants, but I haven't found them mentioned in the sources, and they sure would have come in handy at Thermopylae, so maybe not. And that's just the land forces. He also had plenty of ships, triremes and troop carriers and supply ships from Egypt and the Levant and Anatolia and all around the Black Sea. We'll get into what a trireme is here in a little bit when we talk about the Battle of Salamis. And he also had plenty of Greek troops, Ionian troops and other Greeks from the islands and the Balkans, and yes, some from city-states inside modern Greece, who decided the way to survive was to fight on the side that was more likely to, win. So with all these allies, we have a pretty good idea that the force coming up against the Greeks was big. Unfortunately, we can't say exactly how big. Our ancient sources range from 800,000 all the way up to 5 million or so. But there's just no way in hell the Persians could have assembled that many dudes in one place, or fed them if they did. Modern historians figure the number was somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000, which is still a huge number, even if half of them are ship's crew who don't figure into the land battles at all. Looks like Xerxes wanted to make damn sure he brought enough guys. Anyway, He sent messengers around Greece in 481 BCE as he was finishing up his invasion plans, asking the city-states to submit just like Darius had done in 491 BCE. But unlike Darius, Xerxes sent these messengers to everybody except Athens and Sparta. The message was pretty clear. I'm coming for these two in particular, and anybody who wants to still have a city next year needs to get on board and help me. And some of the Greek cities got on board, just like we talked about a minute ago. And sometime in the spring of 480 BCE, he had his engineers building a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, which is the strait we call the Dardanelles today. Two bridges, actually. Rough weather tore the first one up, so he had his troops go into the water with whips and chains and punish the sea before they rebuilt the bridge. And I guess the water got the message, because the second bridge seems to have held up long enough for him to get his army across the strait. And Xerxes' big-ass hammer started on its way toward the Greek mainland. Now it's almost 500 miles from the Hellespont to Thermopylae. So while the Achaemenids are walking, let's take a look at the Spartans, because these guys are going to be the key to the Battle of Thermopylae. We talked about the Spartans briefly in the story of Marathon, but they're interesting, so we're going to dig a little deeper. See, most of the Greek city-states built their armies on citizen militias, guys who had a regular job until it was time to strap on their armor and go kick somebody's ass. Their idea of an army was something that protected the society, not Sparta. The Spartans pretty much saw it the opposite way. Their society served the army. Every Spartan citizen boy went into a military training camp when he was about 7 years old. From that day until he was too old to serve, his ass belonged to the state. After that, he might serve in the city's government or maybe just hang out on the farm. But make no mistake, he owned the land, but the work of farming, just like almost all the non-military work in Sparta, was done by slaves called helots. Citizens could get blood on their hands, but never dirt. But this single-minded focus on military training did what it was supposed to do. It gave them the best damn army in Greece. The Spartan phalanx could do things other cities' phalanxes just couldn't do. And we've already seen how effective the Athenian phalanx was against the Achaemenids at Marathon. Now we're going to get to see how the Spartans do against them. A couple other points about the Spartans before we move on. They had two kings who seemed to have had more or less equal authority, and they took their religion seriously. And as it happened, they got word about the approaching Persian army during one of their religious festivals. The same one, in fact, that had prevented them from fighting in the Battle of Marathon 10 years earlier. Because during this religious festival, they weren't supposed to do any fighting. Well, fuck that. Xerxes had already made it clear that this fight was personal, and they were on the shit list. They just needed to figure out how to throw down without pissing off the gods. So one of their two kings, Gerard Butler, wait, that's not right. It wasn't Gerard Butler, it was Leonidas, who, if you squint right, does look a little bit like Gerard Butler. Anyway, Leonidas put together a force of 300 guys, making sure to only take guys who already had male sons, so their replacements were already in the pipeline. And they started marching toward the pass of Thermopylae, where they knew the Persians would have to pass through if they wanted to hit Athens and Sparta. Now we talk a lot about the valiant stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, and rightly so. But the story, as I'm sure you're picking up by now, was a little more complicated than the legend we all know about. For one thing, these 300 guys never expected to survive the battle. 300 was a pretty small fraction of the Spartans' total force of around 8,000. But it was enough to make a difference at a place like Thermopylae, where no matter how many dudes you brought to the fight, only a few could fight at one time. But no matter how tightly you can restrict your enemy and prevent him from maneuvering against you, when it's 300 or even a few thousand against the kind of army Xerxes had put together, the best you can do is delay him for a while. So that's what they went to Thermopylae to do. Delay the Persians until the festival was over and the rest of the army could get into it, and the rest of the Greeks could get their forces together. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody say this explicitly, and it was never really part of Greek religion that I've ever heard of, But these guys had to have thought of themselves as something like human sacrifices of one form or another. Because even when they had a chance to escape, they chose not to. More on that in a minute. Maybe it was part of their thinking on how to get around the rule against making war during the festival. If all the guys who broke the rule died in battle, there wouldn't be anybody left for the gods to punish. That's how I like to think about it anyway. So let's get to the war story. No shit, there they were. The BS meter for this war story is about 5 out of 10. I'm doing my best here, but you can imagine we've got some conflicting sources after 2,500 years. So Leonidas and his 300 Spartans started north toward the pass of Thermopylae, picking up allies on the way. By the time they got there in late summer, July or August, they had an army of about 7,000 hoplites behind them. Arcadians, Thebans, Thespians, Corinthians, and others. And the Greeks started getting their navy together as well, assembling a fleet of ships to prevent the Persians from moving troops around Thermopylae to get in Leonidas' rear. But when you're facing an army that's north of 100,000 guys, it doesn't matter that much whether you have 300 or 7,000. I'm not going to say you have no chance because weird things happen in war, but you're going to have a hell of a time finding a bookie to take that bet. Of course, if you're facing those kind of odds, Thermopylae is the place you want to be. See, Greece is covered in mountains, which makes it a pain in the ass to march an army across it. The Aegean coast is one of the best avenues to take an army of any great size, and even the coastal plain narrows down at Thermopylae to around 50 meters wide at its narrowest point. That means the most guys you can put in the pass at one time, if they're fighting shoulder to shoulder in a phalanx, is about 50 guys. And the most your enemy can put in the pass against you is about 50 guys. So instead of 7,000 against 80 or 120,000, you have 50 guys against 50 guys. And with a cliff on one side and the ocean on the other, they can maneuver against your flank, which is pretty much ideal for a Greek phalanx, which is damn near irresistible to the front, but weak on the flanks. Now you still won't be able to keep it up indefinitely, because you don't win a battle by just holding your position. You have to be able to drive your enemy off the field or convince him to leave, and if you can't maneuver against him, that ain't happening. But you can damn well make him earn it. And that's what Leonidas and his 7,000 guys started doing. For his part, Xerxes doesn't seem to have taken him seriously at first. For 4 days he camped his army within sight of the pass, maybe expecting the Greeks to give up and go home without a fight. I guess he missed the part of the tour where we talked about how the Greeks like to scrap. Anyway, they didn't give up and they didn't go home. So on day 5, Xerxes decided to use the direct approach. First, he sent a messenger to ask the Greeks if they knew how to count and to suggest they lay down their weapons. To which Leonidas is supposed to have responded, "Come and take them." Then the messenger said the Persians had so many archers their arrows would block out the sun. To which Leonidas, or a hoplite near him, is supposed to have said something like, "Well, it'll be nice to fight in the shade." So the messenger left, and Xerxes presumably said something like, "Okay, fuck these guys, we'll just have to do this the hard way." But it turned out to be harder for the Persians than for the Greeks. After a few ineffective volleys of arrows, 2 different infantry units charged the Greek lines that first day, and the hoplites drove them back with heavy losses. And the second day was no better for the Persians. The famous Immortals charged against the Greeks, and even they couldn't take the pass. Because the Immortals and everything else that passed for heavy infantry in the Achaemenid army were still a lot lighter in terms of armor and equipment than the hoplites. Their spears were shorter, their armor provided less coverage, their helmets were caps if they had them at all instead of the full head coverage of the hoplites' helmets. And their shields were much lighter than the Greek shields, often being made out of wicker, which is light and great protection against arrows and javelins, but a Greek spear will go right through it. That's generally bad for the poor bastard behind the shield, but now the hoplite has a new problem because the shield is stuck on his spear, which makes it that much harder to engage the next poor bastard. He's got to have a way to get the shield off his spear, or drop the spear and have somebody pass him up a new one, or drop the spear and draw his sword. That may be part of the reason these ancient battles had a kind of rhythm to them. As I understand it, the lines would come together for a minute or two, then pull apart on their own for a few seconds, then get back at it. Because hand-to-hand combat is exhausting, and guys have to pull back for a breather. A little like the breaks between rounds in a boxing match, although they probably didn't have a bell to announce the start of the rest period. And if you have an outnumbered force that's disciplined to this kind of warfare like the Spartans, you can use that brief pause to pull guys off the line and replace them with fresh troops. So the guys in the front line grab the wounded and rotate to the rear, and the next line of guys pushes up to replace them. And that's when you can grab your dropped or broken spears and wrestle the wicker shields off of them and get ready to pass them up to the guys in front when they need them. That's probably how the 7,000 Greeks held off 100,000 Persians for 2 days until in part of the third. Of course, the Persians were probably doing the same thing, rotating guys out of the front line when they couldn't fight anymore, which means they would have tired out much more slowly than the Greeks. But for 2 days, the Greeks managed to hold them off. Then a local shepherd named Ephialtes sped up the Persians' timeline by showing them a path through the mountains into the Greeks' rear. Now, most of the stories about this battle call Ephialtes a traitor, but I think that's putting modern ideas in his head. It's true that he probably got some kind of a payoff, probably a nice big one, for showing the Persians how to get around the pass. But remember, there were Greeks fighting on both sides in this war. And remember that the Greek city-states liked killing each other almost as much as killing Persians. And remember that this guy was a shepherd, and most of the dudes in the Greek ranks were there because they could afford armor and weapons. His life wasn't going to be much different under the Achaemenids than it was under the Greeks. And it sure looked like it was just a matter of time before the Persians won this fight, no matter how hard the Greeks fought. And he had a chance to improve his family's fortunes and get in good with the new boss. So he was an opportunist probably, but maybe just a poor bastard trying to make his best bad decision in a shitty situation. And if none of those factors is good enough for you, hell, he was a shepherd surrounded by dudes with spears and bows. The way he probably saw it, he could sacrifice his honor or his family. We all like to think we would make the hard choice in a situation like that, but how many of us actually would? So yeah, Ephialtes showed the Persians a goat path they could use to get around the Greeks. And toward the end of the second day, a general named Hydarnes led whatever was left of the immortals, plus another 10,000 or so men, along the goat path. Now, the thing about a goat path is it's made for goats, not armies. It's going to be narrow and steep, which means it's going to take a while for 20,000 guys to climb up that way. In fact, it took them all night. In the morning, the immortals bumped into a unit of Phocians Leonidas had set to guard the goat path. But the Phocians seemed to have been confused about what they were there to do because they had set themselves up at a crossroads where one way led to the pass and the other led to their city. Well, they assumed the Persians were there to attack them on the way to their city, so they pulled up on a nearby hill to protect their home. And the Persians shot a few arrows at them and continued on their way down toward the battlefield. Well, the Phocians probably could have blocked the goat path completely if they had attacked the Persians there. And you would have had a mini Thermopylae going on in the hills above the pass, just like the bigger battle was going on down below. But the Phocian commander could count, and the Persians had probably surprised him and his guys in the early morning while they were still groggy, and he saw that he might be able to bring his boys home if he didn't do anything stupid. So instead, he sent a runner to Leonidas to let him know the Persians were coming up on his rear. No word on what particular cuss words Leonidas used when the runner got to him with the message, but I've got to imagine there were a few. But he realized pretty quickly that it was time for the Spartans and the rest of the Greeks to put their money where their mouths were. He had a shitty choice to make. He could hold the pass, and whoever stayed to do that was going to die with Persians on both sides of him. Or he could abandon the pass, and the Persian cavalry would lead the pursuit, and the defenders would lose a lot of guys, run down and stabbed in the back, and Xerxes would be free to move around inside Greece until the remaining city-states could get another army together and oppose him. Leonidas chose to stay and hold the pass, and he gave his allies the same choice. And in the end, about 4,000 Greeks managed to get out, leaving Leonidas with about 2,000 guys to hold the pass as long as they could. Now, I already told you that 300 Spartans probably expected to die there from the beginning. But the guys who chose to stay with them have some interesting stories too. So we're going to look at them now. So among the 2,000 guys who stayed to fight were 700 some odd Thespians and 400 Thebans. The Thebans may have been exiles. Thebes had already surrendered to the Persians, so these guys were probably guys who would rather fight than bend the knee to Xerxes. They may have chosen to stay and die because they had nothing left to lose and no home to go back to. The Thespians are even more interesting because they apparently represented every fucking hoplite Thespii could put into the field. But Thespii was in the region of Greece called Boeotia, which is right where the Persians would be once they got through the pass of Thermopylae. The city had already been evacuated, but you got to imagine the Thespian hoplites could have made it back to their families and fallen in with the armies of whatever cities were giving them shelter if they had chosen to. So it may have been a matter of honor for these guys. The fewer guys who stayed to defend the pass, the less time it would take to overwhelm them, and the faster the survivors would have to run to get home ahead of the Persians, which would have probably meant throwing away their shields and armor and weapons, which was a big deal for a hoplite. To get home without your shield and your weapons meant you had probably run from battle, and that was no bueno for a Greek hoplite. There was a reason Spartan wives and mothers used to tell their men, come back with your shield or on it, meaning come back victorious or dead. I've always heard it described in terms of honor, but there's also a pragmatic consideration here. Armor and weapons are expensive, and they require skilled craftsmen and lots of work to make them. And when the enemy's bearing down on your city is not the time to be forging and fashioning new stuff. So if you throw away your shit in the face of an enemy that's about to hit your city, you've given away one of your biggest advantages. Anyway, yeah, the Thespians may have chosen to stand and fight because they didn't want to throw away their shields. But whatever the reason, there they were, shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans and the Thebans. And now their job was to trade their bodies for enough time for the rest of the army to get away with their equipment. If they could hold Xerxes off long enough, they could save 3,000 or 4,000 hoplites who could maybe come together later and fight the Persians again. And their second objective now was to bleed the Persians as much as they could, so that whatever army the Greeks managed to put together would have to fight that many fewer of them. So after the Immortals had had a chance to get off the goat trail and form up in the pass, Leonidas charged him with part of his force. And it turned out that was his last charge. The Immortals surrounded him and cut his force to pieces. The Thebans, or some of them, may have surrendered at that point. They were captured and branded, and just like Ephialtes, they lived the rest of their lives under the shadow of cowardice. Because, spoiler alert, if you didn't already know, the Greeks are going to manage to pull out a W here in the second half of this war. The rest of the defenders took a position on a nearby hill in the pass, but it was a done deal by then. Persians surrounded them, and after a couple of unsuccessful charges, they stepped back and let the archers do the rest of the wet work. Because no matter how well protected you are, each volley is going to get a few guys. And if the archers don't run out of arrows, eventually you're going to run out of dudes. And that's what happened to whatever was left of the Greeks who had stayed behind in the pass. So what they accomplish? What did these brave warriors buy with their lives? Put another way, why do we still love to tell this story? Well, there's something to be said for immortality, for the courage to stand on your feet and choose your death and face it in such a way that people are going to tell your story for thousands of years. Because as far as I know, every one of us is going to die. But not every one of us is going to have an end worth telling stories about. But no matter how valiantly somebody faces his end, if they end up on the losing side, the chances of somebody telling a story about him is a lot lower. So there's a practical consideration here. When a guy gives the last thing he has to give, his life, he wants to know his sacrifice is for something. So for the low, low price of about 2,000 lives, here's what the Greeks bought at Thermopylae. maybe as many as 20,000 Persians dead. Xerxes' army was still huge, but that's a hell of an exchange rate. Leonidas' final charge might have brought down two of Xerxes' brothers, Abracomes and Hyperanthes. Hell, it's possible taking them down was the reason he decided to charge. This would have been a huge moral victory that boosted the Greeks and played hell with the Persians, maybe even Xerxes himself. 3,000 or 4,000 guys had a chance to get clear to fight again, and they would use that opportunity. The next year, the Greeks would field the largest hoplite army ever assembled against the Persians at Plataea. The goodwill and gratitude of any city-states that were still waffling on whether or not to stand against the Persians. It was still far from a done deal. Xerxes was in Boeotia now with a huge army, and the Greeks had lost after all, but they'd shown that resistance maybe wasn't quite as futile as they thought before the battle. So yes, an L is an L. But this L may just have set the Greeks up for the W later in the war. Now, because we're trying to get through 3 battles in one episode, we're going to skip the full scorecard. But we are going to do a quickie on the 2 or 3 principles I think each side did well in each battle. So here's what we've got for Thermopylae. Leonidas and his Greeks did security and economy of force really well. If they hadn't been able to fight in a choke point, protecting their flanks and limiting the number Xerxes could send against them at one time, this battle would have been over very quickly. Xerxes, for his part, did a good job with maneuver and surprise. The narrow pass kept him from massing his troops the way he wanted to, and the Greek position was too strong for his frontal attacks to give him the quick victory he needed. The goat path was the advantage he needed to get around Leonidas' defense, and the Phocians' failure to defend it allowed him to get the immortals into the Greeks' rear and envelop them. And taking the path at night allowed Hydarnes to get it done before the Greeks could react to block the goat path. And that's the Battle of Thermopylae. If you enjoyed this war story, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your friends about me. Please join me for part 2 of this war story, where we take a look at the other 2 major battles of the Second Greco-Persian War, the battles of Salamis and Plataea. The link is right here somewhere. Till then, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.